My name is Bryn Halcott, and I'm 29 years old. Last Thanksgiving, my father stood up at the head of our dining room table in front of 26 relatives, pointed across the room at me, and said, "You don't have a seat at the adult table until you've earned one." The room didn't quite go silent. A few people laughed. My cousin Terry covered her mouth with her napkin. My sister-in-law looked at the ceiling like she was cataloging light fixtures, and I sat there at the end of the overflow table, the one usually reserved for kids under 12. With my face going hot all the way to my hairline, and I said 2 words back to him, "Okay, sure." Then I folded my napkin, set it next to my plate, and walked upstairs. The next morning he came to my door before anyone else in the house was awake. Sharp knock, 3 beats. The knock of a man who has never once considered that he might be wrong. "Bryn," he said through the door, "it's time to apologize to your brother." The room was empty by then. Bed made, bag gone, closet cleared. On the nightstand, I'd left my grandmother's silver earrings. The ones she'd pressed into my palm at Christmas 2 years before. Face down on the wood. Just the back clasps showing. He would have to pick them up to understand what they were. By the time he came downstairs, someone was already at the front door. But before I tell you who was standing on that porch on the second Monday of October, I want to ask you something, and I mean it sincerely. Has someone in your own family ever made you feel like a guest in a house you grew up in? Drop a comment and tell me where you're from. I read every single one. Let me take you back to the Tuesday in late September when my grandmother died. And the first thing my father said wasn't about grief. Her name was Elspeth Nora Halcott. She was 81. She'd been born in Cape Breton, moved west to the Okanagan when she was 23s with $60 in a single suitcase, and spent 50 years building something from land that everyone else had dismissed as marginal. She died on a Thursday morning at Kelowna General just before 8 a.m., with the Okanagan Hills outside her window going gold in the early light. I was in Vancouver when my mother called. I was in my apartment in East Van, drinking a coffee I'd made too strong, editing photos from a shoot out in Squamish the weekend before. My mother's voice came through quiet and cracked at the edges. "She's gone, Bryn." It was peaceful. I drove to Kelowna that same day, 4 hours through the Coquihalla in the September rain, with the radio off and the mountains gray on both sides. My father was already in the hospital corridor when I arrived. Bernard Halcott, 63, retired municipal court judge. The kind of man who irons the creases into his pants and expects you to notice. He wasn't crying. He was on his phone, speaking in a low, controlled voice about something called an executor filing timeline. He ended the call when he saw me. He didn't say hello. He said, "You made good time." My brother was beside him. Darren, 35, corporate law, Bay Street firm in Toronto. He was wearing a blazer to the hospital. He had his hand on my father's shoulder like they were posing for something. I stood at the far end of the corridor, with a cup of tea from the vending machine that I never drank. I thought about the last time I'd seen my grandmother, 3 weeks before. She'd been sitting up in her hospital bed with the window cracked, and she'd taken my hand in both of hers with a grip that still surprised me. Her voice had gone low and careful, the way it did when she wanted something to land properly. "Bryn," she'd said, "I've looked after everything. I need you to trust me on that. Will you?" I'd nodded. I hadn't understood what she meant yet. The funeral was held at St. Andrew's in Kelowna. The church was full. White chrysanthemums, a mahogany casket, October light coming pale and clean through the high windows. My father gave the eulogy. He spoke for 14 minutes about legacy and stewardship, and what the Halcott name meant in this valley. He said my brother's name 5 times. He said my mother's name twice. He did not say mine once. I counted. I was sitting in the second pew and I counted all 14 minutes. Afterward, in the receiving line near the church door, a woman I didn't recognize found me. She was perhaps 65. Silver hair pulled back neatly, a dark wool coat, small pearl earrings. She took my hand with both of hers, the same way my grandmother had. "Elspeth talked about you constantly," she said quietly. "Your work, your stubbornness." She almost smiled. "I'll be in touch." She was gone before I could ask her name. That evening, 17 of us gathered at the family house, the old Halcott property in the South Okanagan, out past Penticton, on a hill above the lake. 4 acres of fruit trees and sage and dry grass, a cedar farmhouse with a wide porch. My grandmother's vegetable garden running down the south slope. She'd spent 50 years calling it the property, and never once called it anything grander than that, though it had been worth considerably more than that for decades. My father sat at the head of the table. He raised his glass. "Mum left her affairs in order," he said, looking around the room. "And as executor, I'll be managing the transition of her estate to ensure her assets are used responsibly, by the people who are in a position to do that." His eyes found mine for just a moment. "No one needs to worry about the details." I set down my fork. "Dad," I said, "Grandma told me she'd looked after. Your grandmother was not well at the end," he said, talking over me smooth and easy as drawing a curtain. Whatever she may have mentioned, it has no legal standing. These things are complex, Bryn. Let the adults handle it. My brother nodded. My sister-in-law adjusted her wine glass. My mother stared at her plate and did not look up. She never looked up. I went upstairs that night to my old bedroom. The Georgia O'Keeffe print I'd taped to the wall at 16 was still there, curling at one corner. I sat on the edge of the bed, and out of a reflex I hadn't used in years, I opened the drawer of the nightstand. There was an envelope inside that had not been there before. Cream stationery. My name on the front in my grandmother's handwriting, deliberate, pressed hard, like she'd wanted the letters to stay permanent. Inside, a letter and a partial photocopy of a document. At the top of the first page in plain print, testamentary trust agreement, Elspeth Nora Halcott. Partway down, highlighted in yellow, beneficiary, Bryn Elspeth Halcott. My hands were shaking before I finished the first line. Bryn, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and your father is already doing what I always knew he would. I am sorry I could not stop him while I was alive. I could not change who he is. What I could do was protect you from the result of it. The full trust documents are with my solicitor, Marguerite Ose-Bonsu. Her office is in downtown Kelowna on Lawrence Avenue. The copy I've left you is partial, not enough on its own, but enough to show you I am telling the truth. Don't show your father, don't show Darren, don't even tell your mother yet. Wait until the time is right. Marguerite will know what to do. You were always my brave, difficult, extraordinary girl, Bryn, and you were always worth more than this family gave you credit for. All my love, always, your grandmother. I pressed that letter against my chest and sat in the dark for a long time. 3 weeks later, I received a forwarded email. It came from my brother, sent to me by accident, I can only assume, because the subject line read, Estate, Variation Application Draft, and the chain beneath it was 7 messages long. My brother and my father. Back and forth. My brother had drafted a notice of variation application to the BC Supreme Court. A petition under the Wills, Estates and Succession Act, requesting a reallocation of trust assets on the grounds that the named beneficiary, me, was financially unstable, lacked property or long-term assets, and was therefore unsuitable to receive a significant inheritance responsibly. He had cited my freelance income as evidence, my rented apartment in East Van, the fact that I'd changed careers at 25 from marketing to photography. He called it, in a line I had to read twice, a pattern of impulsive decision-making inconsistent with the responsible management of substantial assets. But the line that made my vision go completely white wasn't the legal language. It was at the very bottom of the chain, casual, like a note left on a fridge. She won't challenge it, Dad. She never does. That's always been the point. I screenshotted every message, backed them up to 2 separate cloud drives. Then I called my mother. I told her to let my father know I'd be coming for Thanksgiving. She paused for just a second, then she said, "That's good, sweetheart, he'll be pleased." I didn't say anything to that. I was already opening my contacts to look up Marguerite Ose-Bonsu. The next morning I called her office. The receptionist put me on hold for 9 seconds. Then, "Ms. Halcott? Miss Ose-Bonsu has been expecting your call. Can you come in this week?" 2 days later I was sitting across from her at a wide oak desk, on the 4th floor of a building on Lawrence Avenue. Lake Okanagan, visible and flat and silver through the window behind her. She was the woman from the funeral, calm, deliberate, the kind of person who has heard every variation of every family's worst hour and knows exactly which drawer to open. "Your grandmother retained me 11 years ago," she said. 8 years ago, she came back with a specific request. She wanted to establish a testamentary trust, activated at her death, naming you as sole beneficiary, she said, and I'm quoting her directly. "Bernard will try to undo this. Make sure he cannot." She slid the original document across the desk. A testamentary trust established under BC law, administered by RBC Trust Services. Total assets. The South Okanagan property, valued at approximately $540,000, and a separate investment portfolio totaling $148,000. My grandmother's signature, in blue ink, at the bottom of every page. Notary seal. Witness signatures. Everything in order. A testamentary trust of this kind, once it forms part of a validated will, cannot be varied without your written consent or a successful court application. Marguerite said. Your grandmother anticipated exactly what your father would attempt. She had her family physician assess her cognitive capacity the month before signing. The assessment is on file. She scored in the 93rd percentile for her age group. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for 3 weeks. There's more, Marguerite said. She opened a second folder. Your father filed his variation application 6 weeks ago. He represented to the court that you were estranged from the family and could not be located for notification. She looked at me steadily. He has your phone number, your email, and your mailing address on file. You attended the funeral. You stayed in his house. I showed her the email chain. She read it without expression. Then she looked up. This constitutes misrepresentation to the court and a breach of his fiduciary duty as executor. If you want to respond formally, you have more than enough. I want to respond, I said. She nodded once, then, almost gently. There is one more thing your grandmother included in the trust. She turned to a later page, a clause transferring personal property, specifically, a 1.2-acre waterfront lot on Skaha Lake in Penticton. The small cedar cabin where my grandmother had taken me every summer since I was 4 years old, where we'd sat on the dock on July evenings, watching the water go copper in the last light, and she'd told me I was the kind of person who would figure things out. Even the things nobody in the family had thought to name yet. She'd left it to me. I went very still. Marguerite watched me take that in. Elspeth spent years making sure this was airtight, she said. The only question now is when you want to use it. Thanksgiving, I said. He's invited the whole family, 26 people. She studied me for a moment, then she gave one slow, certain nod. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I drove east through the Fraser Canyon with one bag, my good coat from a consignment shop on Main Street, and a folder of notarized copies. The originals stayed with Marguerite. The Halcott property came into view through the stands of ponderosa pine the way it always did. Cedar siding weathered to gray, wide porch, the old apple orchard running down toward the lake. From the outside, the picture of a family that had everything settled. My mother met me at the door and held on a second. Too long. My father barely said hello. My brother made a comment about my car. My sister-in-law smiled her polished smile. I smiled back and said nothing. I went upstairs, slid the folder under the mattress, and stood at the window, looking out at my grandmother's vegetable garden. Brown now, unpruned, the tomato cages still standing with nothing left to hold. Nobody had tended it since she'd gotten too sick to kneel. I pressed my palm against the cold glass. I'm here, Grandma. Thanksgiving morning, the house filled the way it always did, incrementally, and then all at once. By noon, 26 relatives occupied every available surface. My father moved through all of it like a man presiding over a verdict. I was placed at the overflow table, the one set up in the sunroom, between my 11-year-old second cousin and an empty chair. I helped carry dishes I hadn't been asked to help prepare, because that was how it had always worked. At 4 o'clock, my father stood at the head of the main table, with the chandelier above him, and raised his glass. This Thanksgiving we remember Mum, he said, and we celebrate what she built. This family, this land, which will carry forward in the hands of someone ready to carry it. I'm proud to say your cousin Darren has just been named equity partner at Brennan & Associates. Applause. My brother accepted it with a practiced half-smile. From the sunroom doorway my aunt called out, "What about Bryn? Anything exciting going on, sweetheart?" I opened my mouth. "Bryn is still working things out," my father said, not looking at me. "She takes beautiful photographs. We're proud of her in our way." A small, warm ripple of laughter moved through the room. Every family needs someone to remind the rest of us to slow down and notice things. Right, Bryn? More laughter. Easy and generous and entirely at my expense. My young cousin beside me looked up. "Are you okay?" she whispered. I passed her the dinner rolls and nodded. After the pie was mostly gone and the wine had been flowing for an hour, my father stood again. The room quieted. "Tomorrow morning I'll be sharing Mum's estate decisions with anyone who'd like to be present," he said. He found me across the room when he sees it. His smile had an edge underneath it. "We'll get everyone on the same page." That night I did the dishes alone. My brother came to lean in the kitchen doorway, with a glass of red wine dangling from 2 fingers. "Bryn," he said, "I just want you to understand. What Dad's managing with the estate is genuinely complicated. Tax implications, probate timelines, asset structures. You'd need a whole different background to really follow it." I kept scrubbing the roasting pan. Something in me, something that had been held under tension for the better part of 29 years, went completely still and then quiet. "Darren," I said, without turning around, "do you know what Grandma actually left me?" The silence behind me changed texture entirely. I looked over my shoulder. His face had gone careful in the way faces go when someone is rapidly recalculating. He left the kitchen without a word. 8 minutes later, my father's voice came from the living room. "Bryn, in here." I dried my hands. I walked in. 26 faces turned toward me. My father stood in the center of the room with the posture of a man built to command silence. "What exactly did you say to your brother?" His courtroom voice, level and large and built for finality. "You're making accusations about this estate. You're upsetting people," I started to answer. "You don't have a seat at the adult table," he said, loud and clear for the whole room. "Until you've earned one, go back to the sunroom. You'll stay there until you're ready to apologize to your brother and let this go." 26 people, and the room moved. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. My Aunt Terry covered her mouth. My brother looked at the floor. My sister-in-law made a small, bright, delicate sound that was not quite laughter, but was not laughter either. My mother sat in the corner armchair with her eyes on her hands. I held my father's gaze for 3 full seconds. Then I said, in a voice that surprised even me with how steady it was, okay. I turned and walked upstairs. I closed the bedroom door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed. I picked up my phone. Marguerite Osibonsu answered on the second ring. Miss Osibonsu, I said, can you be at the house at 9 tomorrow morning with the originals? A pause. I'll be there at 8:30. I set my alarm for 4 a.m. and sat in the dark, listening to the low sound of voices and laughter drifting up through the floorboards. Enjoy it, I thought. It's the last night it feels like yours. I left at 4:17 in the morning. No scene, no argument. Just my bag, my coat, my folder, and my socks on the stairs so the boards wouldn't creak. I left my grandmother's silver earrings face down on the nightstand, just the clasps showing, and that was the only punctuation the sentence needed. I drove to a Tim Hortons 14 minutes from the house and nursed a double-double for nearly 3 hours, watching the Okanagan dark turn gray, and then pale and then a clear, cold October blue. At 7:50 my brother texted, "Where are you?" Dad's asking. I did not reply. What I heard later from my cousin Alana, my father came downstairs at 7:45 in a fresh shirt, poured his coffee and said, "Someone go get Bryn." Nobody moved. He went himself. He knocked twice. He opened the door, empty. Bed made. Bag gone. Earrings face down on the nightstand. He stood in that doorway, Alana said, for a long moment. Then he came back downstairs, his voice very flat. "Bryn's gone, ran off." My brother looked up from his phone. "Well," he said, "that settles it." "It does," my father said. "We'll proceed with the estate announcement now, since there's no point." The doorbell rang. My mother opened the front door. Marguerite Osibonsu stood on the porch in her dark wool coat, a leather briefcase at her side, her expression like the surface of a lake in the moment before a storm moves in. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Marguerite Osibonsu. I am the solicitor of record for Elspeth Nora Halcott's estate. I need to speak with this family, right now. What happened in the next 40 minutes is something no one in that room has spoken about directly since." Marguerite walked into the Halcott house the way I imagine she had walked into every difficult room for 40 years. Unhurried, fully in possession of herself, carrying the weight of other people's choices and knowing precisely what to do with all of it. My father rose to his full height. "Marguerite, this is my home. You were not invited. I have a fiduciary obligation to the named beneficiary of your mother's estate," she said, "and I am here because that obligation has been compromised." She set her briefcase on the dining table and opened it. "Elspeth Nora Halcott established a testamentary trust 8 years ago, naming Bryn Elspeth Halcott as sole beneficiary. Mr. Halcott, you are aware of this. You were notified in writing at the time of probate." She laid the original trust document on the table. "The trust also transfers the Skaha Lake property to Bryn directly. Both are irrevocable without Bryn's written consent." My father's jaw tightened. "My mother's mental state at the time of signing was assessed by her physician that same month," Marguerite said. She did not raise her voice. Not once. 93rd percentile cognitive function for her age group. The documentation is filed with the BC Supreme Court. The trust is valid and it is standing. She looked at my father without blinking. "What is not valid is the variation application you filed 6 weeks ago." The room, all 26 of it, had gone completely still. Marguerite opened a second folder. "You represented to the court that Bryn could not be located and had not been in contact with the family. She attended the funeral. She stayed in this house within the last month. You have her phone number, her mailing address, and her email on file with the estate." She set a printed page on the table. Then she took out the email chain and read the relevant line aloud, clearly, into the silence. "She won't challenge it, Dad. She never does. That's always been the point." 26 people turned and looked at my brother. He said nothing. He had the expression of a man watching an avalanche from much too close. My father said, "Darren, don't. The variation application constitutes misrepresentation to the court," Marguerite said, "and a breach of your fiduciary duty as executor. I have filed a formal response with the registry this morning and notified the BC Law Society of the conduct at issue." My father said, This is, Bernard." My grandmother's younger sister spoke from across the room, her voice steady and not unkind. "Elspeth told me 8 years ago what she was doing and why she was doing it. She needed someone to know. I'm sorry it took this long for everyone else to be in the same room." My father sat down. He didn't speak after that. He sat down and the authority just drained out of him like water out of a cracked vessel, and for the first time in my entire life, he looked like an ordinary person, not who had done something he would not be able to take back. My brother attempted briefly to argue the procedural timeline. Marguerite addressed every point in 2 sentences or fewer. My sister-in-law said nothing at all and examined the wall. My mother from the corner chair said quietly, almost to no one in particular, "I knew." I've known for a long time. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. She didn't finish the sentence. But something in the room shifted, and I think everyone present understood what she had been living inside of. By 10:15, my father had retreated to the back office and closed the door. He did not return. The following week, Marguerite filed the formal response with the BC Supreme Court. The variation application was dismissed. Within 30 days, the trust assets were transferred, the South Okanagan property registered in my name, the investment portfolio under RBC Trust Services, and the Skaha Lake cabin transferred directly on title. My father was formally removed as executor for breach of fiduciary duty. My brother received a conduct notice from the Law Society of British Columbia. As of the last I heard, it remains under review. My father, from behind the closed door of that office in a house his mother had built with her own money and her own stubborn years, issued no apology. He never has. He told anyone still willing to listen that I had ambushed the family and destroyed Thanksgiving. He continues to call himself the wronged party in all of this. That is his right. I find I don't spend very much time thinking about it. A month after everything was finalized, I drove south to Penticton on a Friday afternoon in November. The key was where my grandmother had always kept it. Under a flat stone near the lavender bed she'd planted along the south wall. The cabin smelled like cedar and old wool blankets, and something sweet I couldn't place at first, and then could. Dried apricots from the tree at the side of the property. She had always kept a bowl of them on the kitchen counter, summer and winter alike. On the small table inside, she'd left a photograph of the two of us. Me at age 7, her kneeling beside me in the vegetable garden, both of us covered in dirt, both of us laughing at something out of frame. On the back, in her handwriting, "This one knows things she hasn't been taught yet." I sat down at that table and cried for a long time. It was the first time in months that what I felt was relief, instead of something braced against impact. 6 months after Thanksgiving, the investment portfolio proceeds cleared my remaining student debt entirely. I used the early trust returns to open a small photography studio in Penticton, on the main street, a 5-minute walk from the lake. And I named it after the property, not the family name, because the property had always been my grandmother's and the name had meant something different in her hands than it ever had in my father's. My mother reached out in January, not by text, by letter, 4 handwritten pages on plain paper. She talked about choices she had made and ones she hadn't. She talked about what it costs to stay quiet in a room where someone else is always louder. At the end, she wrote, "I should have stood beside you a long time ago. I'm standing beside you now, if you'll still let me." I kept that letter in the same envelope as my grandmother's, because they felt like they belonged together. And, slowly, carefully, in the way things rebuild when given the right conditions, she and I began again. My brother has not reached out. I do not expect that he will. What I think about now, when I sit on the dock at Skaha Lake on early mornings with my coffee and the water going pink in the first light, is what my grandmother understood long before I did. That being dismissed by the people who were supposed to see you is not a verdict. It is just information, and if you are patient with it, you can use it to understand precisely what you're working with. She used that understanding to quietly, carefully, over the course of years, build something they could not dismantle. Then, she handed me the key, and trusted that I would know what to do with the door. The lavender she planted along the south side of the cabin came up in June, purple and wild, and slightly overgrown, because nobody had tended it for 2 seasons. I spent a morning in early summer out there with gardening gloves, and a pair of old pruning shears, cutting it back the way she'd shown me when I was small. It bloomed properly in July, full and unhurried and completely unbothered by everything that had happened to it in the meantime. She would have called it stubborn. She always meant that as a compliment.